Right.
Lower the inch just a little bit. Yeah, perfect.
Can you see it now?
Get a little. Yeah, I can see it now.
All right.
All right, go ahead.
Oh wait, hold on. Start one more time.
It's Monday, March 18, 2018. My name is Roy DeBerry in the offices of North Mississippi Rural Legal Services. In the room with me are April Grayson, Maureen Tutorini, Caleb Hall, Justin Gary, Dylan McKellar, and Ryan Pierce. We're speaking to attorney Ben Cole. Ben, could you share with us your date of birth, where you grew up, and place of birth?
Yes, my name is Ben Cole Jr., and I was born in Marshall County, right outside of Holly Springs, Mississippi.
And so where did you go to high school and college and that sort of thing?
I went to Holly High School in Holly Springs, Mississippi. Went to college at Rust College, Holly Springs, Mississippi, and then went to law school at Drake University in Des Moines, Iowa.
Could you talk a little bit about your family in Holly Springs, either parents or grandparents, and the kind of impact they had on you with respect to education?
Well, yes, I was raised by my grandparents, and one of their main concerns was for education. That was one of the things that they were concerned about, and they impressed upon us as we were raised by them. My grandfather only finished 7th grade, but he knew the importance of education, and he did very well as a result of actually only receiving the 7th grade education. And just a little background on that, he was able to, in his lifetime, buy, and I guess at the time that he passed, he owned about 500 acres of land. But he was a farmer, and we were raised on a farm, but that was one of the things that education was the thing that was really important to him. And one of the things he did instill in us, and he said to me, was, I'll teach you how to farm, but then we want you to get your education, and then you can always go as far as your education will take you, but then also I'm going to teach you how to farm, so if you need to fall back on something, you know how to farm.
Given the fact that your grandfather was not that far removed from the institution of slavery, how did he come about the fact that he could get 500 acres of land in a place called Benton County, Mississippi?
Well, actually, he was originally from Benton County, but he ended up settling in Marshall County, which is, in fact, the property that he actually owns property. He owned property in both Marshall County and Benton County, but he actually lived in Marshall County, which was right next to the Benton County line, and actually his father owned property, and it was one of those kind of situations where his father, as I understand it, went through a situation. I guess I guess today we would call it Alzheimer's, and he ended up not really, as I understand it, not totally in terms of in control of his faculties. He ended up deeding his property away to someone else, and there was a long process in which the lawsuit was filed, and they were able to regain some of the property. And but in the process, he ended up having to buy his own property. I think some of the property that they saved went to his other brothers and sisters, and so he ended up having to buy his own property. And so he just, I guess it was a situation where he just worked hard, and God blessed him, and he had opportunities as various pieces of property came up, he was able to purchase that property.
Before we get into your professional work, could you tell us about Ben Cole, about your own family, your siblings, your children, just who is Ben Cole Jr.?
Yeah, well, as I said, I was raised by my grandparents. I have no brothers. I'm the oldest of 7. I have 6 sisters, and my father and mother divorced when I was at an early age. I don't ever remember them actually living together as husband and wife, so they divorced. My father was a teacher by trade. In fact, he was a math teacher in the Benton County school system, and my mother was pretty much a homemaker, and so with the seven of us, I always say that it was a blessing that I was the oldest. But we, as growing up, my grandfather pretty much just said, well, since it was just the two of us, he and I, as males, we pretty much took care of things on the outside of the house. My grandmother and sisters took care of things in the house, inside of the house, for the most part. But of course, my sisters also had to chop cotton and pick cotton, and so it was one of those learning situations in which we learned to work hard for what we got.
Given the fact that you own your own land, then did you know anything about the sharecropping system, or were you exposed to the sharecropping system, or did you participate in the sharecropping system given the fact that your parents and grandparents own land?
I was aware of it. Yes, there were instances, a couple of instances in which there were people who worked on the sharecropping terms with my grandfather on some of the property that he had. But then I was also aware of people who lived around us that were sharecroppers. So yeah, I was aware of that.
Given the fact that you mentioned that your grandfather only had a 7th grade education, and your father went on to teach school, math specifically, what person or people in your family influenced your decision to go to law school after you had graduated from college?
Well, I guess it was I think probably just my interest in law. I guess I developed that early in school and in our civics class. As in our civics class in school, that was something that just it is something that attracted me, and so I was interested in that. So I kind of gravitated to law, and then I kind of had in the back of my mind. For some reason, I developed that in the back of my mind that was something that I'd like to do. We did have an instance where, as I said, I was raised by my grandparents. My grandfather adopted me and my sisters, and I remember when we went to a lawyer in Holly Springs who did the adoption, and then that also influenced me. I think it had an influence on me in terms of the law. And as I went to Rust College, Rust had an exchange program with the University of Iowa, and under that exchange program, we would go to school in the mornings, and then in the afternoon we had an opportunity to work. And so I ended up having an opportunity to work for an attorney. And basically I was doing yard work for the attorney, but then also had an opportunity to interact with him and talk with him. And I think as I talked more with him, then that interest that I initially had for becoming a lawyer, really, I mean, that really piqued that interest. And so
given the
that
fact
had a big
that
influence in terms of me wanting to pursue that.
Gotcha. So given the fact that you mentioned how you came about the decision to go to law school, was there any particular person, again, that had the greatest influence on your life up to that point? Obviously your grandfather you talked about a lot. Are there other people at that point that in your judgment would have had the greatest influence on your life?
Well, I guess in terms of my life, yeah, obviously started with my grandfather. I think in terms of high school, there were several teachers in our high school that had a big influence on me. I can think of Professor Henry Boyd, Jesse Jackson, and there were some others in high school. But then in college, Rust College, I would say the biggest influence, the person that influenced me at Rust was probably Dr. McMillan, who was president of Rust College. And he took an interest in students who needed to really learn more about education and about really how you go about pursuing education, studying. And I remember one of the things that stands out in my mind was we kind of felt like to some extent we were behind at that point in terms of people across the nation. And so because of his influence, a lot of times when we went to lunch line, we had our books. And so while we were waiting, we were reading. And he kind of encouraged us to do that. He said, you don't really have much time, you don't have time to waste. And so he said, even while you're in the lunch line waiting to get your lunch, you can have your book and you can be reading. And so that person had a large influence on me also in terms of pursuing education.
We'll move now to North Mississippi Rural Legal Services, and you can share with us some of the history of how this organization got started and who were the original executive director. But what dates or do you recall when you first came to North Mississippi Rural Legal Services? Did you come as executive director or did you come as an attorney?
Actually, I came as a managing attorney for the Holly Springs office, and backtrack just a little bit. After I left law school, I had a job with a legal services program, Atlanta Legal Aid in Atlanta, Georgia. So I went to Atlanta immediately after I graduated, and I stayed, worked in Atlanta for 2 years. But while I was in Atlanta, first I passed the Georgia bar, and then I took the Mississippi bar because I always wanted to come back home. I had some, again, in the back of my mind, I always wanted to come back to Mississippi and try to do what I could as it relates to law, and opened my own office, did private practice for about 2 years. And actually, I say that I was actually doing legal services work when I had my own office, but I wasn't on the payroll. Mm-hmm. And so the thing about that was that there were people who were employing me to handle cases, but they didn't have the money to pay me. And so there was an opening in Holly Springs. At that time, there was an office, North Mississippi Rural Legal Services had an office in Holly Springs, and the managing attorney of that office left. So actually, I was recruited. Skip Robinson, who was on the board, I think maybe chairman of the board at that time, who's from Holly Springs, and also who knew me, actually reached out to me and actually recruited me and convinced me to come as managing attorney of the Holly Springs office. So that was 1976. And from that point, I guess I kind of rose in the ranks from that point. During that time, I think the next step was I became a regional managing attorney, which meant that I was in charge of 3 offices, the litigation, and for 3 offices, which was the region. I think that was the North region. I believe they called it the North region. From that, then I was elevated to become the litigation director, and for a while after that, I was actually acting director for about 6-8 weeks, doing a search for a new executive director of North Mississippi Rural Legal Services.
You mentioned that you took both the Mississippi bar and the Georgia bar, and I would assume that Atlanta is a much larger city than, say, Holly Springs, Mississippi. Sure. You had mentioned earlier about the fact that in private practice you were sort of doing legal services because a lot of the clients couldn't pay. Were there any concern in your own mind about the idea of coming back to Mississippi and giving up an opportunity to make much more money working in Atlanta as opposed to coming back to Holly Springs, or was that not a factor for you?
It really wasn't a factor because I really wanted to come back to Holly Springs, and I really wanted to help people, and so that really wasn't a factor.
Then again, so what influenced your choice to work at the North Mississippi? I mean, specifically, was it because of the fact that it was dealing with poor people?
It was, the fact that it was dealing with poor people and the type of litigation that it was involved in. I mean, it was not only just handling what I call just the run-of-the-mill regular type cases, such as divorces, which are obviously important to people who need the voices, but it was also handling cases, class action lawsuits that affected the rights of a number of people. And it was at a time when it was after the Civil Rights Act had been passed. It was after Brown versus Board of Education, in which it took people to actually file lawsuits and litigate to vindicate the rights of people. And so I saw that as something that was really needed, and I wanted to be a part of that. So that attracted me to come to North Mississippi Rural Legal
So then at
Services.
the time, did you see whether or not there was any difference between the civil rights movement and what was going on with legal services, given the fact that the state of Mississippi, and perhaps even the country, didn't particularly put a lot of emphasis on the rights of poor people at that time? Were there similarities between what was going on with the movement and what was going on in legal services?
There definitely was.
Could you tell us more about?
Well, I guess doing those similarities, I guess it was to me it was an opportunity, one, to practice law, to get some experience in terms of practicing law, but then also do something that's actually going to help a number of people, because it was obvious that even though the laws, the civil rights law and other laws had been passed, unless and until people that were interested, that were impacted by that, unless they stood up and came forth and filed lawsuits, then those rights were not going to be vindicated. And so I saw that as a role that North Mississippi Rural Legal Services was playing at that time. And at that time, there was no other entity doing that type of litigation. There weren't many private lawyers who were handling cases like that, especially in North Mississippi. And so it was really kind of an exciting time for me to just have an opportunity to be a part of that.
What kind of support, if any, did you get from people like Eastland and Stennis and the federal government at that point, in terms of being supportive of the idea of providing services for people who were obviously not economically, privileged?
Actually, there wasn't any support, and if anything, there was really efforts to maybe thwart that effort. I think, even as I recall, kind of vaguely recall at this point, I think in terms of the early startings of legal services, I think there initially was a requirement that I don't know if it was the governor or someone in the state had the right to sign off on the grants for the legal services programs, and there were efforts to prevent legal services funding for legal services to happen. I think that was during the early years when the initial funding for legal services came through OEO, the Office of Economic Opportunity, and so I think that was during a time when there were persons in the state who had the opportunity to try to veto that or thwart that effort. And so I think there was a loophole, so they found a loophole so that the funding did continue. And so that's how legal services started initially as a part of the OEO effort. And so legal services, so actually there was federal funding for North Mississippi Rural Legal Services and other legal services programs across the country that came through OEO. And that was the first time that there was federal funding for legal services,
Okay.
which made a big difference.
Mm-hmm. Would you tell us who was the executive director of legal services when you started working initially as a managing attorney? Who was the executive director at the time?
The executive director was Wilhelm Joseph.
And tell us a little something about Wilhelm and your relationship.
Yeah, Wilhelm was a person he was originally from Trinidad, and he was actually, I think he actually was recruited, or he was able to come to the United States on a track scholarship. In fact, he went to Mississippi Valley State University on a track scholarship. Then he went to Ole Miss Law School, and so and he ultimately ended up being executive director of North Mississippi Rural Legal Services. And he was a person, I guess because of his background, he was known as as a fighter for the rights of poor people. And Wilhelm, actually, I think, as I recall, Wilhelm at one point was a client of North Mississippi Rural Legal Services during the time that he was a student at Mississippi Valley State. And I guess as a result of that, I guess he, and as I am told, I don't have firsthand information about this, but I'm hearing Wilhelm talk. He talked about the times that he was involved as a student in various marches and having been arrested and feeling and that he was mistreated, and so I think that piqued his interest in becoming a lawyer, and so he came to Ole Miss Law School, and so during that time, I mean, he was very keen on the program being involved in litigation that made a difference in the lives of poor people, and at that time. As I said, the funding initially was from OEO, and there were no restrictions on legal services programs handling class action lawsuits. And Wilhelm actually recruited people, lawyers who had that interest, who had that fire in the belly, so to speak, that wanted to be involved in that type of litigation and wanted to litigate cases which would make a difference in the lives of poor people.
So what other executive director, we're going to get to you, Ben, later on, but who that you served under as executive director other than Joseph?
He was the only one that I served under as executive director. There was, at one point, there was acting director Jesse Pennington, and then after Jesse, then I ended up being the acting director for a few months until they hired a new executive director. And so after that, and I think that was about 1983, and so I was here, so they hired a new executive director, and so I think I was on staff maybe for about 6 months after the new director came in, and so then I was hired as executive director in Arkansas, as it was East Arkansas Legal Services at the time, with their office in West Memphis, Arkansas. So
Okay.
I went to West Memphis and served as executive director over there for 15 years.
Okay. Before we get to your tenure as executive director, did you know Louis Myers?
I did.
And what was he also an executive director?
No, Lewis was director of litigation.
Okay.
And
What would you share just a few things for the audience about Louis Myers?
Yeah, Lewis was also he was a person who I'd say he was kind of a rambunctious person in the sense that he had a larger than life attitude, but he was adamant in terms of litigation to vindicate the rights of poor people, and Lou is credited with masterminding really the major lawsuits that North Mississippi Rural Legal Services handled. In fact, he was the mastermind behind the heirs lawsuit, which
Explain that
challenged,
to me.
yeah, which challenged the inequity in funding by the state funding between the historically black universities and the historically white universities, and that lawsuit went on for us, although North Mississippi Rural Legal Services was not in it for all of those years, but I think North Mississippi Rural Legal Services litigated the case for about 25 years, and then there was about 2 years, maybe 3 years at the end that we were not allowed to be involved in the lawsuit because of restrictions by the Legal Services Corporation. So we had to get out of the lawsuit, but it was a lawsuit that was the brainchild of Louis Myers and litigated by North Mississippi Rural Legal Services. Alvin Chambliss was one of the main litigators in the case, and actually Alvin Chambliss ended up ended up arguing the case. The case actually ended up in the United States Supreme Court, and Alvin argued the case there, and the case was remanded. So as I said, it went on for a total of about 27, 28 years.
That's a good segue to the next question. That is, since Louis was over litigation, from your standpoint and what you did, what was the most important thing you worked on in terms of cases at North Mississippi Legal Services? Was there any particular case that you would consider to be the most important, or were there just a series of most important cases?
I'd say there was probably just a series of most.
I know you mentioned the Ayers case. Was there anything else?
Yeah, I did some work on the Ayers case, but then there were school desegregation cases, there were redistricting cases, and just a number of cases, types of cases that we were involved in. And we helped out on cases. There were lawyers, and at that time there were 11 offices that North Mississippi Rural Legal Services had, but we helped each other on those cases, especially preparing for trial, sometimes second cheering on those cases, doing research on cases. So yeah, there was just a number of cases. I'm not sure if there are any that particularly sticks out as being more important than others. But I'd say probably, I guess the category of cases that I would say probably sticks out more at this point probably would be the school desegregation cases. There was the case, I think it was Anthony versus Hot Springs School District that desegregated the Hot Springs School District, Hot Springs schools. I think there was another case that desegregated the county schools in Marshall County. But then of course, in Oxford, there was Quarles versus the Oxford School District. Quarles was the son of Mildred Quarles, who was a board member. She was a client board member of North Mississippi Rural Legal Services. And so her son was the lead plaintiff. She and her son the lead plaintiff in that lawsuit. But there were most of the school desegregation cases in North Mississippi was handled by North Mississippi Rural Legal Services in the Greenwood area, Cleveland area, Clarksdale area. Pretty much all of those lawsuits were filed and handled by North Mississippi Rural Legal Services.
So clearly, based on, you mentioned the OEO at the time, I guess was President Johnson was President Johnson the president of the country when North Mississippi Rural Legal Services came about?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So, given the fact that you focused on anti-poverty and people who were poor, what do you consider the most positive ways the North Mississippi Rural Legal Services has impacted the community, be it Oxford, be it Greenwood, be it Holly Springs? Or is that very difficult to discern?
No, I don't think so. I think North Mississippi Rural Legal Services played significant roles in, I'd say, 2 or 3 major areas. Of course, I think the first one is in litigation, the significant litigation that it was involved in during that time, especially the late 70s and into the 80s. That was a role that during that time they handled cases that private attorneys were not handling. So they filled that void. And I think another big role that it played was that it provided a place for especially African American lawyers once they got out of law school to have a place to go out and practice law, learn the correct way to practice law. At that time, the major law firms were not opening their doors to those law students and to newly barred lawyers. And so the options at that point were either to go out and hang your own shingle, so to speak, and learn to practice law, because we know that you generally don't learn to practice law in law school. You learn the law, but you don't learn to practice law. Mm-hmm. So you need to actually learn to practice law. So one of and I learned that the hard way too, in terms of when I went out to and started my own practice in 1974, that you actually learn just to learn the ins and outs of actually practicing law. there was, and actually I mentioned Jesse Pennington earlier. Jesse Pennington was one of the lawyers that kind of took me under his wings before he came to North Mississippi Rural Legal Services, and before I came to North Mississippi Rural Legal Services. He was a practicing attorney in West Point. And so I reached out to him, and he kind of took me under his wings and kind of helped me learn the ins and outs of practicing law with your own private practice. So North Mississippi, so the other, so that was the one option, was to go out and hang your own shingle and try to learn. The other, but then North Mississippi Rural played a very important part in the sense that it had that opportunity. There was an opportunity. The monies were made available to North Mississippi Rural Legal Services to hire lawyers and to then teach lawyers how to practice law. And so that was very significant in that part. But then the other part, so one, that's they taught lawyers how to practice law, but then they also, the lawyers then handled cases that were significant for poor people in North Mississippi Rural Legal Services. So I think that was a very important role that North Mississippi Rural Legal Services played. And I think that's some other
for just a sec, y'all.
Yes, just
We
one
need
second.
to change back.
Camera rolling.
I think another significant role that North
wait,
Mississippi
hold on.
Rural Legal Services played is that it was a training ground for
Wait, cut.
lawyers.
We
Cut. Sorry.
Sorry, we-
nasty audio up, I'm sorry.
Do
Yeah,
we-
we gotta clap real quick. Sorry about that.
Okay.
So are we
Go
starting
ahead,
another
Justin.
one?
Go ahead, Justin. Lower, a little lower. Sorry.
Yeah, no,
go
that's
ahead.
fine.
We're not seeing you, Justin. Gotta do it in front of his face. Right there.
Yeah, just lightly. That's good.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's fine.
I
All
think
right, we're ready.
another significant role that North Mississippi Rural Legal Services played was it served as a training ground for lawyers and for future leaders in the state of Mississippi, but actually not only in the state of Mississippi, but in this nation. The alumni of North Mississippi Rural Legal Services in terms of lawyers, you can see that throughout the state in particular, but then even in the nation, are some of the most successful lawyers in this country. And they came out of North Mississippi Rural Legal Services. Politicians came out of North Mississippi Rural Legal Services. They got their start here. Judges, especially across the state, came out of North Mississippi Rural Legal Services. They got their training here. And so I think that's really a significant role that it played. But it also, there were other people that trained paralegals. It was one of the early training grounds for paralegals. And in terms of Wilhelm Joseph, in terms of having the foresight, we initially started out with what we called community workers, who were people who went out into the community and related to the community and kind of saw what the problems were in the community and brought them back to the lawyers. And then the lawyers, then when they had clients, then they would litigate those cases. But then Mr. Joseph then saw the need for people to not only just be social workers, but then as time changed, then he had a class. He set up a class. He had a teacher to come in and teach the social workers about actually being paralegals. So people then started being trained as paralegals, and they were actually given a certificate as paralegals. So they learned to do legal research. They learned to work up divorces and various types of cases that they worked along with the attorneys to assist the attorneys along the way. So in that regard, it played a significant role throughout the northern part of the state of Mississippi.
Okay, Attorney Cole, in light of the fact of, you mentioned people of national renown, for the record, could you name some of the judges and the politicians and some of the other lawyers who did their tenure here but went on elsewhere? Just some.
First, I'll start with judges. One of the judges, actually, Willie Perkins, Sr., it was the board chair of North Mississippi Rural Legal Services for a number of years. Actually, from I guess about 14 years. He just recently was elected circuit court judge in Greenwood. Another board member, Solomon Osborne, has just has been actually was sworn in today to fill the position of House of Representatives that Mr. Perkins previously had. Perkins had a successful law practice in Greenwood, and he was elected to the House of Representatives and served in the House of Representatives for a number of years. At the same time when he was serving on the board of North Mississippi Rural and as a board chair. And so at the end of 2018, as a result of being elected judge, he had to resign from the board. Solomon Osborne, who is also on our board, ran for the position, and as I said, he was just sworn in today into that position. But I practiced law with them. They were, both of them were from Greenwood, and we had an office in Greenwood. But as I said, we helped each other, and so we worked together at North Mississippi Rural Legal Services. There are other judges Judge Carol White, who at one time managed the office in Greenville, Mississippi. Carol White, by the way, is originally from Marshall County, Holly Springs, Mississippi. Linda Coleman, who was a board member, longtime board member of North Mississippi Rural Legal Services, actually got her start. I think she started out from law school as a staff attorney in the Clarksdale office, and then went into private practice, served on the board of North Mississippi Rural Legal Services, was elected to the House of Representatives from the Cleveland area, and then now she's serving as judge from that area. There's just a number of people that came through North Mississippi Rural Legal Services that have distinguished themselves in as in those instances. You can see that there are various positions that they've held, and starting with the practice of law and distinguishing themselves as lawyers, and then moving on to the legislature or moving on to become judges.
I think this is a good opportunity again to segue to funding, and I think this may relate to the fact that your tenure as Executive Director of Rural Legal Services. What notable changes have you seen in the field of the organization over the years, from the early years to the middle years to now? Just the challenges that you have faced in terms of funding, and what's the major source of your funding? Well,
initially, as I said earlier, the first federal funding was from the Office of Economic Opportunity, and so of course that OEO was dismantled probably 2 or 3 years after it started, and but one of the things that came out of that, and that was part of the President Johnson's war on poverty. One of these, and they tried a number of programs that was designed to attack and actually designed to be a war on poverty. And so when the program was dismantled, one of the things that they looked at and realized was that funding for legal services to the poor was one of the most successful programs. And so then they decided to try to figure out, how do we carry this on? And so ultimately they decided to develop a legal services corporation, a national legal services corporation, so there was the Congress established a national legal services corporation, and they called it, and of course, Legal Services Corporation. Mm-hmm. So, and it was interesting enough, one of the last official acts of President Nixon was to sign into law the Legal Services Corporation Act, which established the corporation. And then, so each year, then Congress appropriates funding to fund legal services programs across the nation. And so, and of course, Mississippi is one of the receives its share of funding based on the number of poor people within the state. So that was a significant change in the sense that federal funding, the funding that was appropriated by Congress, then substantially increased the funding for legal services across the nation. And it impacted Mississippi in the sense that I think from about 1976, it was about 1976, 77, that substantial monies for legal services came to the state. And so that was during the time that there was a growth, a significant growth in terms of the offices that North Mississippi Rural Legal Services had. I think it had about 3 offices initially until the Legal Services Corporation funding. The corporation was established, funded a significant funding, and then that developed. There was an era in which there was an expansion, and so that was the time that North Mississippi Rural Legal Services grew from about 3 to 4 offices to 11 offices across North Mississippi. The northern 39 counties of Mississippi is the service area of North Mississippi Rural Legal Services. This is the area that the organization is authorized to represent low-income people. So 11 offices were established across North Mississippi Rural Legal Services as a result of that funding. Then, come around 1980, when President Reagan was elected, there was a pushback in terms of funding for legal services, and actually there was some attempt to totally do away with federal funding for legal services. There was some there were a number of people philosophically believed that there should not be federal funding for legal services, and the private lawyers should just take cases pro bono or free of charge for poor folks, and that would be sufficient. And as a result of that, there was a compromise in which the funding for legal services was cut by 25%, but then also a requirement that some of the money that legal services programs received would go to assist in getting private lawyers to do pro bono cases. And so that was known as the Private Attorney Involvement Initiative. And so that did substantially result in making it easier for private lawyers to handle cases for poor folks on a pro bono basis or for free. Then, I guess from there, the next substantial challenge, I guess, in terms of funding was about 1996 with the Newt Gingrich contract on America, and in which again there was an attempt to roll back funding for legal services, and again funding was cut by 25 to 30%, and then additional restrictions was placed on the funding in terms of what the lawyers could do. I mentioned earlier about the fact that the legal services programs handle class action lawsuits and handle the school desegregation cases and these various class action lawsuits. But one of the main restrictions that came out of that of the compromise in terms of continuing the federal funding for legal services was they did cut funding again, but then also they restricted the legal services programs prohibited legal services programs from filing class action lawsuits or being involved in class action lawsuits. And also, I mentioned earlier about legal services had to get out of the heirs lawsuit. That directly resulted from that 1996 compromise in which legal services prohibited from being involved in class action litigation, and so we had to divest ourselves of our involvement in the heirs lawsuit as a result of that. I guess since that time, the funding has kind of fluctuated. There's been some years in which there was no increase in funding. So mind you, we've already got these, you know, we've had these instances in the 1980 era in which 25% of funding was cut. Then we move on pretty much level funding. 1996, there was another 25–30% cut, and then there was no significant increase. But then, of course, even with level funding, when you get level funding, of course, that's really amounts to a cut because the cost of business continues to go up. And since that time, there's been we have gotten some small increases. There's been a couple of years in which there was actually some small decrease, and so for the most part, we're pretty much at level funded. Right now, there was a small increase over the last couple of years, but just small increases. I think those increases will probably have been probably enough to kind of a cost of business increase to kind of keep us along those lines. So in the meantime, what legal services programs across the country had learned pretty quickly was that it was necessary to seek non-legal services funding. In the early years, when the funding, when funding was quite a bit of funding, we pretty much just relied 100% on the funding from the Legal Services Corporation. Now we've had to diversify, seek non-legal services corporation funding, and so we're getting monies and grants from various funding sources. And so actually we are at a point now where we are probably about 50%, about 50% of the funding is from the Legal Services Corporation, and about 50% is from non-Legal Services Corporation funded, which is a significant jump, especially for Mississippi.
Thank you. I know this is speculative, but how would things have been different Northern Mississippi Rural Legal Services had not existed?
I think it's pretty clear that the types of changes that occurred through court action would have been delayed a number of years. I have no idea how many years it would have been, but I think there would have certainly been times when there would have been private attorneys who would have been taking cases, just as they are on an individual basis, that they could make a difference. But I think they would not have had the resources to actually litigate those cases. So I think the change would have been much slower, and it would have occurred over a much longer period of time. And I think that's another significant thing about legal services, was because of the resources that it had in terms of, one, being able to hire lawyers, train lawyers, but then also have the money and the resources to hire experts and to adequately litigate cases and put them in a position to win cases.
I think given what you've said about your experience with rural legal services, how has the impact been on your life, and then you can share with us what other experiences you'd like to share. But just, I know you've impacted the organization, but how has the organization impacted your life over a period of the 20 years or so you've been director, as well as a managing attorney for a number of years? Just a panoramic view of just...
Yeah, it's just certainly just a personal satisfaction of being able to, I guess, one, just realizing the desire to practice law, and having satisfaction in knowing that I was able to make a difference in the lives of a number of poor people, to help people who would not otherwise have had any place to go to get a lawyer to handle their case. Were it not for North Mississippi Rural Legal Services, a number of people would not have been able to get a lawyer and to have a lawyer to represent them. And so to be a part of that really has been a pleasure for me. Initially, I was a practicing lawyer. I handled a number of divorces, especially when I was in Holly Springs. handle a number of divorces and, you know, those kind of cases, in addition to the work that I did on the impact cases. But now, as executive director, I think as I developed and evolved, and especially as the prohibition from legal services being able to handle class action litigation, to be able to impact positively the lives of a number of people, because we realize, you know, you can only do so much, but the class action lawsuits allow you to impact a lot of people, especially if you're successful in your litigation. Since we are no longer allowed to handle those kinds of cases, for me to be able to work in an organization and I guess have some direction of an organization that can go out and seek additional funding to allow us to provide representation for people and just not be satisfied with doing the regular cases. I think the theory behind cutting out class action lawsuits and really specifying that legal services be involved in what's kind of known as day-to-day litigation, such as divorces, you know, those types of cases. Those are significant cases, and has significant impact and importance upon people who has that need. But there are other needs, and to be able to go out and seek grants, write grant applications, and get funding to provide. Let's say go out and we're now getting funds, especially grants, to allow us to represent people, domestic violence victims of sexual assault, you know, those types of things. We have some grants through the Internal Revenue Service that allows us to represent low-income taxpayers. We have grants that allow us to represent people who are about to lose their homes through foreclosure. So we have a foreclosure prevention grant or project. We have an elder law project in which we specifically represent people who are 60 and over, and we get funding to allow us to do that, so we can specifically represent those people and provide services that the elderly, particular needs of the elderly. So that's in addition to that allows us to handle cases that we otherwise would not be able to handle on our regular legal services corporation funding.
Thank you. You've covered a lot of territory. Are there any other lasting experiences you would like to share with us about the long tenure at Rural Legal Services? Anything for young people that you would like to share?
Yes, I would just say for young people, I think especially lawyers getting out of law school, this is a great training ground. You know, and we've seen a number of lawyers a lot of people, they come out of law school and they come to work for legal service, some maybe 2 years, some 3 years, but they basically learn how to practice law, and then they can open their own offices, and they know how to practice law. They can make money as well as do good. And also the other thing I think that comes out now is we basically teach lawyers the importance of, even when they are private lawyers, to give back, to do pro bono cases, do cases free of charge for people in the community. And so I think the other significant thing is that over the years we've developed a significant relationship with the Ole Miss Law School, and it really kind of, it really goes back to its start, back to its roots, because North Mississippi Rural Legal Services actually started out of the Ole Miss Law School. Mm-hmm. And so now we have relationships with the law school, where we have various law school clinics, so the students while they're still in law school can work in clinics, but then they come to North Mississippi Rural Legal Services, and they can actually assist lawyers while they're in law school and get a better sense of and get a little bit of a taste of what it's like to practice law, and especially kind of see what the need is in the low-income community. So whether or not they come to work for legal services, or whether they go into private practice or go to work for a large law firm, they got a sense of what it is for what the legal need is for poor people, and so then I think that encourages them to then give back, so that they can be in a large law firm, but then they can practice. I mean, they can take cases that they can work with us, take cases that we refer to them, which we otherwise would not be able to handle because we don't have the lawyers to handle all of the cases that for people who qualify. And so again, we can integrate private lawyers into the work that we do.
Well, thank you, Attorney Cole.
Okay.
And
It's been a
thank you.
pleasure. Thank you.
Okay.